Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ramadan Kareem, and welcome back to Cyber Night Season 3. My name is Hamad Al-Aqil, and today our guest is Mr. Joزيبي Briziu. How are you doing, Mr. Joزيبي?
I'm good, Ahmad. Thank you for asking. How are you?
I'm great. We're very, very glad to have you here today with us. Of course, Mr. Joزيبي, you have a lot of experience, maybe 20 years plus in technical and security. A very, very big background. Today, you will be talking about cybersecurity in a digital everything world. But before we get into that, I would like you to briefly enlighten our viewers about yourself.
Definitely, that would be my pleasure. Let me start by sharing my screen. Here we go. So my name is Joزيبي Briziu. I'm Chief Information Security Officer, EMEA at Qualys. Has been in this role for roughly a couple of years. And prior to Qualys, I've been working for Nestle, the well-known food and beverage company, where I had the opportunity to cover several different leadership executive positions across a number of functions, as you can see on the slide, being finance and control, information systems, digital transformation, and so on and so forth. Also had the opportunity to experience different industries, being the food and beverage, pharmaceutical, because Nestle is a large conglomerate. Then my highlights, actually, my career at Nestle has been delivering the ISO 27001 for one of the globally managed business at Nestle. You can see the details on the slide, and where I had the opportunity and the privilege to be the security and compliance officer. So interesting, experience I had the opportunity to have, and I look forward to share this with you. So what we're going to have today is in the agenda. We will start by just having a key facts, figures, and trends in cybersecurity, just to set the scene and give the context in the reality that we're all living in. We will then follow with the changing IT security landscape, basically the challenges that we are confronted with in today's digital age. And then there will be the three major areas where I'd like you to really be very conscious and aware about. First being the visibility of IT assets. We'll discuss and we'll share, we'll talk about this in detail. The subsequent one will be the risk mitigations. As we all know, cyber risk is a business risk, and we'll be talking about a risk-based approach to cybersecurity, everything revolving around prevention and remediation. Last but not least, despite all the efforts made in prevention and remediation, if an intrusion, a breach, a compromise happen, the capability of quickly detecting and responding to those attacks is paramount. It's also known as being sure that we are cyber resilient. We have the ability to really react upon those kind of threats. So without any further ado, let's deep dive in the cybersecurity key facts, figures, and trends. We have some sources where I took those metrics from Cybersecurity Ventures, from the World Economic Forum, from Gartner, and from KPMG. The first one is just to mention the magnitude of the cybercrime damage that we're currently experiencing. Is an amazing amount, actually. If you see in 2021, it was about $6 trillion, and it is projected to go above 10 trillion. If you look at this amount in 2021, and you compare with the largest economy in the world in terms of GDP, so the gross domestic product, the 6 trillion or the cybercrime will be the third largest economy after the US and China. So it's really, really frightening. Now, in terms of volume of attacks, this might be all sorts of numbers, but it revolves around tens of millions, hundreds of millions, knowing that just a few percentage of those cyber crimes are actually reported. This also explains also the fact that for the cyber attackers, getting caught and prosecuted is unfortunately very unlikely. Some statistics illustrate it is less 1% of probability for a cyber attacks to get caught and prosecuted. Now, when we talk about ransomware, I think we're all familiar with ransomware and all the dynamics relating to it. If you look at 2021, again, is an amazing number. It's 20 billion USD. Knowing that as I've been told, a number of occurrences, a number of situations never get reported. So, and the projections over the next decade is a consistent 30% growth year over year, reaching well beyond 260 billion US dollars by 2031. The also even more, I will say, concerning information is that in 2021, we basically experienced a ransomware attack, in average one ransomware attack every 11 seconds. And this, unfortunately, is going to increase, reaching the 2 seconds benchmark by 2031. Again, ransomware attack, not all of them are successful, but nevertheless, the frequency, the volume of it, and also the sophistication is really, really concerning. Now, if we look at real quick on the number of groups also that are on the rise, also for the reason I mentioned before, it's really, really difficult to get caught and get prosecuted. It's around about 1,900 distinct hacking groups that, as you can see, the number increased from 2019, which was at the 1,800 marks. The 5 most cyber attacked industries over the past 7 years, as you can see, healthcare, manufacturing, financial services, government, and transportation. And if we look what is going to happen this year, what is expecting to happen, we have new industry entering into the top 10 of the most attacked industries, which is retail, oil and gas, energy and utilities, media, entertainment, legal and education. So clearly, watch out. All the businesses and all the organizations, as we all know, individuals have to be very, very, I would say, careful when it comes to cyber attacks, and clearly keep a cybersecurity hygiene to the highest possible level. Now, if we talk about sea levels, there's an interesting outlook report from the World Economic Forum, who surveyed 120 global cyber leaders, asking what were the highest concerns. And those are the top 3. Ransomware attack, we've been mentioning it right front and center. The social engineering attacks, as we all know, the human factor, and we need to have people understanding where they get caught into a social engineering scam. And also the third one is malicious insiders. As we all know, the insider threats. Again, this is a very, I would say, concerning threat. The interesting part as well is that 40% of the company boards will have dedicated cybersecurity committee by 2025, which for some like myself who have an industrial background, it reminds the time of having safety committees that in industrial environment are now the normal, actually, the new normal. The cybersecurity committee will also do the same level of attention that is for safety should also be given to cybersecurity. And the good news is that this will come pretty soon. Then there's the cybersecurity as an interesting one. That's not the panacea for all the issues in cybersecurity. Actually, there will be a misconception if somebody will think, okay, I'm cyber insured, I'm safe, there's nothing to worry about. On the opposite, actually, cyber insurance is a complement of what is a cybersecurity program is in place, and you will clearly need to have a cybersecurity high level of standards to then be eligible for cyber insurance. So 71% of the respondents of the same Outlook report have informed to be cyber to have a cyber insurance. And the thing is, this is a very volatile market, yet in a sense that the cyber attacks and ransomware particularly are on the rise in terms of volume, in terms of sophistication. So it's clearly the premiums will increase. So the effort on the cybersecurity side will need to keep up. Otherwise, the circumstances and the prerequisite to be cyber insured that could provide you assistance in case of a breach with professional services to deal with a compromise, just to mention one of the service, that will be difficult to obtain if you don't reach a certain level of certain standards in terms of cybersecurity. So this just to paint the picture of where we stand overall, and the clearly, I would say, not really encouraging, but really challenging and concerning environment we're all confronted with. Now, when it comes to the changing IT security landscape, we're facing an accelerating digital transformation. And this is not just to refer to the, actually, to the cloud computing in terms of cloud adoption and the cloud migration. Is also referred to the wide variety of new technologies that are appearing on a continuous basis. We'll discuss this in a moment in more detail, but it's clearly making the environment more complex, more hybrid, and more difficult to secure. That's basically the challenge. The second one I'd like to highlight is the remote workforce or hybrid workforce. Like there are IT assets, IT environments getting more and more hybrid, guess what? Also the workforce is getting more and more hybrid. We all experienced during the pandemic where workforce had been pushed to work full-time from home. And nowadays, nearly quote-unquote post-pandemic, this dynamic will remain in place, not in the same proportions that we experienced during the pandemic, but there will be a clear hybrid model that will take place. There are some statistics and surveys where employees are being surveyed. Actually, 48% of them are really in favor of full remote work. 44% very much inclined to hybrid working model, and we have companies actually more than 51%, actually, or more than 50% of the companies in favor of hybrid work model. So this model is there to stay. And the challenge here is that you will find employees and consequently IT assets being laptop, mobile devices, and the like, operating from places that are not designed from a security perspective, like, for instance, corporate offices behind a firewall. So this brings a new level of challenge in terms of ensuring the right level of security, the right level of patching, because, again, employees can work from home, can work from co-working spaces, utilizing eventually Wi-Fi hotspots, and the like. The third one is, I guess you're all familiar, you heard about the Great Resignations and the dynamics that appeared during the pandemic, which is about work-life balance. So people start to think about their professional life and their private life and find a better balance. We all know that in cybersecurity, actually, is a clearly very demanding area. It's a very, let's say, challenging environment, and clearly sometimes even quote unquote stressful. So we need just to make sure the way our resources are, managed in cybersecurity, or in this clearly avoiding having repetitive tasks or having to, I will say, manual workloads. And this is clearly advocates for more automation in cybersecurity. That's clearly one of the imperative. And even more importantly, actually, there's a shortage of skills in cybersecurity. I guess you might have heard, but Nowadays, we are revolving around 3.5 million on a global basis, a lack of resources in cybersecurity. That started back in 2014 with 1 million, going up to 3.5 million, meant to stay at that level until 2025. And hopefully will start to decrease because, of course, educations and training programs are taking place. Now, let me deep dive a bit on the accelerating digital transformation. So we were talking about digital world, and just mentioned about all the different kind of new technologies that are taking place. And as you can see in there, we basically have different kind of technologies being on cloud, being on premise, being the usual workstations or mobile devices, but also nowadays web containers. We have OT, operational technology. We have Internet of Things. Just for connected objects, just to give you again some key metrics here. I think nowadays we are revolving around 22 billions connected objects. This is meant to go beyond 30 billions in 2025. So you can imagine the large, I will say, proportions of convergence in terms of OT and IT, and consequently, in attack surface is getting more and more bigger. So a playground more and more, I will say, wider and broader for the cyber attackers. Then we have, software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. There's a lot of areas where then the other ones that you can see in here real quick, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and so on, but also 5G, and many more. So the list could be endless. What I'd like to draw you as a parallel, just to illustrate, I think we are all familiar with the notion of the physical world, of the notion of biodiversity. Biodiversity being all the sort of species, being animal species or plant species that we have. And just for instance, just to give you an example, in the island of Borneo, we have 1,400 different kind of animal species and 15,000 different kind of plant species. I won't even talk about the world because we go up to millions. But in that case, if you want to protect those species, we need to know them. We need to understand their weaknesses. We need to know exactly where they are. So the analogy here is like we have this biodiversity in the physical world, we do have also a digital biodiversity in the digital world with several different quote unquote species in terms of technologies that require to be understood, require to be visible. We need to know where they are, and we need to understand their weaknesses to be in a position to protect them. So this just goes along the lines of the visibility that was mentioned at the beginning of this of this episode. And clearly the key message here is making everything visible, and that is the way to make everything secure. So I think we're all familiar with the fact that it's already difficult, it's already hard to secure what we know, which is basically impossible to secure what we don't know, what we can't see, or what we do not understand. So the message here, we need to have a set of technology, or we need to have the usual finger on the pulse. We need to have a set of sensors that allow us to understand and identify each and every component of the IT hybrid environment. So, and depending on the kind of species, quote unquote, kind of technology, you need to have an adapter sensors that can really detect that kind of device, that kind of assets. So we might have passive scanners, active scanners. We can have cloud connectors, container sensors. We can have cloud agents, and so on, and support. The purpose is to really catch them all. I mean, that visibility is paramount, is the foundation for any effective and successful cybersecurity program. So this clearly will enable to understand what are the weaknesses, what are the vulnerabilities actually, and understanding, for instance, what are the assets exposed to the internet and that are more, I would say, prone to be attacked because easier to reach. Understanding the kind of software is on those assets, if it is unauthorized and clearly is representing a risk, or missing authorized software. If there are some blind spots actually in there, for instance, maybe assets that not been scanned for too long, and it clearly represent a risk. Or even more importantly, if there's a assets that have end of life or end of support. We used to say that end of life is beginning of life for a cyber attacker. So to be very, very carefully identifying what are currently already on the end of life or end of support, or what assets are going to become end of life, end of support over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months. That's extremely important. So the imperative here is more than ever to make everything visible. And I like to insist, it's not just a visibility from time to time. It's not just a snapshot here and there. It's a continuous visibility. It's a visibility that is all the time and in real time. So this continuous visibility is I keep emphasizing, underlining, and highlighting is the prerequisite for continuous security. Now, if we move to the risk mitigation, remember what I said at the beginning. The risk mitigation is the cyber risk is a business risk. So, as such, has to be treated in terms of, has to be assessed and understood from a business perspective, in terms, especially what are the implications of on a business side, what are the impacts in case a risk materialize. But before coming to it, I'd like just again to draw a parallel, as I mentioned before, on the biodiversity. So we need to understand, to be able to protect species, to be able to protect the assets in the digital biodiversity, we need to understand what the weaknesses are, what the vulnerabilities are. So here you can see in this graph the vulnerabilities known as the CVEs, so common vulnerabilities and exposures, that are provided by the National Institute, so the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And as you can see, the vulnerabilities are constantly on the rise, and they're now well past the 18,000 numbers actually in 2021, with a growing number also in the highly critical ones. So the volume is huge, and of course it cannot be tackled not all the vulnerabilities can be tackled at the same time for obvious reasons. So there is a notion of priorities that we'll discuss in a moment. There is a notion of a risk-based approach. The riskier one, sounds obvious to say, but the riskier one should be tackled first. And of course, remember that, and we'll reiterate this concept during this episode, is the longest the vulnerability remains unresolved, unpatched, the higher is the probability for an attacker to be successful. I will repeat that. The longer vulnerability stays unpatched, the higher is the probability for a cyber attacker to take care of it, so to take advantage of it. So clearly here is it is a call for action and for prevention. So really resolving those vulnerabilities, those weaknesses before it's too late. So the prevention, I'd like to briefly mention this quote from Benjamin Franklin, who was used to say that the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Clearly, a lot of effort has to be made in prevention. So by identifying vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, and remediating them, that is what ultimately will reduce the risk and will mitigate the risk It will make an anti-hybrid environment less exposed to attacks. Will harden the surface basically. What I'd like to draw your attention here is the process side of things. So when it comes to risk mitigations, it's really extremely important that you look at this from an end-to-end process. It's not just enough to it's not just sufficient to identify vulnerabilities, having a nice list, a nice repo to say job done. Job is far to be done, even if that list is prioritized. The cycle has to be completed. I mean, it has to be when the vulnerability is resolved, being patched, remediated, then is where the box can be ticked. It's where basically the exposure to that risk is resolved. This is known as time to remediate, and I'd like to reiterate the message I mentioned before. The longest is the time you take to remediate. So the longest is the time to remediate, the higher is the probability for a cyber attacker to be successful, to exploit that vulnerability. So clearly the defenders have the vested interest to have the shortest possible time to remediate. So it's a kind of a race actually between attackers and defenders. The one who gets there first makes it. And I think we all know, let me also share this, I think we all know that unfortunately for the defenders, actually, the attackers just need one occasion to get through, whilst the defenders have to be right all along because they need to audit the entire attack surface, and they cannot miss a single one. At least again with this notion of priority that I mentioned before. Now, if we look at the end-to-end process, we need to be in a position to ask ourselves, again, I reiterate the point about the visibility. Do we know where the assets are? Remember the analogy about the digital biodiversity and where they are and and then the second one is what kind of weaknesses they have, meaning what kind of vulnerabilities, what kind of misconfigurations they have. So that's extremely important. And then, but more importantly, this risk-based approach is not all vulnerabilities are equal. Besides, if you focus also on the critical ones, there might be some of them that based on threat intelligence, they have some active exploits out there, being either a malware, being a ransomware. So it sounds obvious to say those are the first one to be remediated, to be resolved, to be patched. And clearly, that's the last step. That's where the patching part comes in, and that's to really close the loop and resolve the vulnerability or the misconfiguration. Now, that's basically the key message. It's extremely important that to mitigate the risk, there should be a vulnerability management program in place that allows to discover, assess, prioritize, and remediate critical vulnerabilities. That's the cycle, the life cycle I mentioned before. One more time, it starts with the visibility across the hybrid environment with all the components, all the quote-unquote species that are in there. It continues with understanding on a continuous basis what are the weaknesses, meaning what are the vulnerabilities, what are the misconfigurations, and then the notion of prioritization. What are the ones more, let's say, more likely to be exploited, and obviously coupled with the notion of business criticality, depending on the type of assets, and then the last steps in terms of patch management. Clearly, and remediation for misconfiguration to close the loop. That's really paramount. It's important for the risk mitigation part. Now, let's move to the threat detection and response. And real quick, you can open magazine, newspaper, and so on every day. There are, despite the best efforts we can make in prevention, and we should continue in doing so, by the way. Remember, once ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure. So, but despite the efforts, we need to be prepared because compromises, intrusion, breaches will happen. As unfortunate as it's not a matter of if it will happen, because it will to different degrees, but it will. It's a matter of when it will happen. And then, of course, we need to be ready for it. And I'd like to draw your attention to two areas, actually. One is the endpoint detection and response. And just prior to it, I'd like to briefly mention about the endpoint protection, which are components like the anti-malware, like the web protection, like the intrusion protection systems, like anti-phishing, and so on. So that's a kind of a shield, also known as a shield. So we'll repeat that is endpoint protection. It's a kind of a shield with it's kind of a, the defense around the fortress, around a castle. And it should clearly, as the image says, it will avoid people coming in. It will avoid malware coming in. But there might be situations where there's a malware, a zero-day malware that is not known by the EPP, and then is where the EDR comes into place, has the ability to detect it and has the ability to respond it. So if the EPP is the endpoint protection is the shield, the EDR is also known as the sword, being is able to react to that attack, to respond to that attack. So again, on the EDR end-to-end process, you see that it starts with the asset management, really having a holistic view of all the endpoints that are part of the IT hybrid environment, and making sure that the EDR is activated on it. We'll see in a moment that not all assets, unfortunately, have the opportunity to have the EDR. And some connected just won't be able to, but we'll see that in a moment. Extremely important, the endpoint detection response has to have the ability to really detect malwares and in malicious, suspicious attacks. And there are some frameworks for those who are familiar with, like MITRE ATT&CK, which basically describe all the tactics, techniques, and procedures. That's what the TTP stands for: tactics, techniques, and procedures. And immediately detect a pattern to say, oh, this is a suspicious, this is a malicious behavior, so needs to intervene. So clearly having the ability to analyze this kind of situations, and then correlating it with threat intelligence and correlating with threat indicators, with logs and other activities on the endpoint. And this is for the sake of really creating actionable and prioritized insight. And particularly what we reiterate is making sure that we do not create, false positives. There's a notion, an indicator called signal to noise. That's very important. It's the right signal that can be acted upon, rather than just a multitude of insight that won't reveal, that will basically create alert fatigue at the end of the day. And then once those prioritized insights are available, then you go for the response, and it's a response first, clearly by containing the attack. It can be by quarantining the endpoint, removing the job or killing it, but also actually going to the preventive side of things. Remember the risk mitigation, because we might have similar endpoints that have not been attacked yet, but the analysis show that this was due to a vulnerability. So preventive patches should take place, or a configuration measure should take place in case of a misconfiguration. So ultimately, as an image to keep in mind, the EDR is the endpoint detection and response. It's like a microscope installed on the endpoint specifically, and it analyzes everything that is going on that endpoint. As is mentioned here, requires an agent, but ultimately is really focusing on the endpoint. And then, of course, depending on where this EDR is located, it could eventually be part of a broader solutions where you have other elements around it, and you can further correlate and analyze the data collected by the EDR. Now, if we move to another aspects of the threat detection and response, is what is known also the XDR. XDR, the X stands for extended detection and response. So I'd like to mention this first, which is again a real fact, but is like with an anecdote. It happened a few years ago in Las Vegas, and this is about the fact that for certain endpoints and certain connected objects, you cannot really install an EDR. You cannot install an agent, since you cannot have an EDR. Consequently, if something goes wrong on that connected object, you heard before how many connected objects we do have nowadays, well beyond 20 billions, getting 30 billions plus in 2025. So the little anecdote, I wouldn't say funny actually, was because that was a real fact, that there was in a casino in Las Vegas where there was a fish tank, actually an aquarium, where there was a connected object meant to regulate the temperature of the water, the salinity of the water, feeding the fish, and so on. And guess what? Some cyber attackers had been able to compromise that connected object, do a lateral movement actually there, and find the crown jewels and exfiltrate data. That's the real fact actually. So on that connected object, you couldn't have an EDR. So that's where XDR, among others, comes into play. So because it has a broader view of the entire IT hybrid environment, and basically allows the EDR feed the XDR. So the XDR collects is a broader repository of everything that is basically happening in simple terms in the IT hybrid environment. And ultimately is the EDR feed the XDR, but also it collects, the XDR collects authentication events, it collects operating systems and application logs, it collects network defenses, information of firewall traffic, and so on and so forth. So VPN traffic, among others. But this gives us the holistic view of what is going on in the IT hybrid environment. And ultimately, in this, again, end-to-end process for the XDR, yes, this process has the ability to really assess the risk posture at any point in time across the entire IT hybrid environment. And second, assessing the assets criticality. And assets are not necessarily static. They might not be very critical during a certain period of time of their life, but then becoming very critical because all of a sudden maybe a financial database has been installed with very critical financial data, and all of a sudden the priority for that asset gets higher and has to be treated as such. And super important is the fact that in this repository, the data can be analyzed and correlated, and there's all the telemetry, all the data points, the metadata, the signals that are being gathered and stored into this central repository. This single point of reference is basically enable them to identify malicious or suspicious activities, and as such clearly generate reliable alerts and prioritized insights that will enable them again to act and remediate and resolve. So, in a nutshell, actually, if you look at it from a higher perspective, the XDR operates in the entire IT hybrid environment, whilst the EDR is specific on the endpoint. So in other words, the XDR operates like this wide-angle lens, yes, this enterprise, this holistic view. And it's particularly obviously relevant because it can cover basically all the components of the IT hybrid environment, including components where the agents cannot be installed. Consequently, the EDR cannot be installed. So here's the final slide, and just to summarize, the three key areas where I wanted to draw your attention and making sure that you take into account this is also absolutely essential for an effective and a successful cybersecurity program. The first one, and I'll reiterate one more time, is about the visibility. So again, not the visibility from time to time, but it's the visibility all the time in the real time. That is absolutely essential. And this is also known as a discovery phase, really understanding all the assets that are out there. And we know that the IT hybrid environment are getting more and more complex. They keep expanding. They're getting more and more difficult to secure. So the visibility is absolutely key. And also, I would also add is having the ability to detect those assets, but also to gather additional data. Okay, we won't have the time to discuss this, but enrich the data with data coming from the hardware manufacturers or the software vendors to understand the versioning, to understand the end of life, the end of support, and so on and so forth. The middle part is the risk mitigation. So we've been discussing, remember, also prevention worth a pound of cure. That's absolutely key. This is to hardening the attack surface, basically to make it more difficult for cyber attackers to exploit the vulnerabilities, so actually reduce the number of vulnerabilities, because when a vulnerability is resolved, is one less opportunity for a cyber attacker to be successful. An important point that we haven't touched, we can touch real quick, is we can also do what is known as a shift left, so ensuring the risk mitigation, so the prevention and remediation at the time of DevOps, so development operations, by ensuring what is known as a security by design or security built in. So making sure that what gets developed is secure, and when it gets to production, there are no vulnerabilities in there, and of course things can evolve over time. And it's the reason why you keep monitoring and analyzing vulnerabilities and misconfigurations going forward. But at least that is an important piece that is getting more and more embedded into DevOps practices. And as we mentioned, it's continuous vulnerability detection. Remember, it's continuous visibility, but then it's continuous vulnerability misconfiguration detection. And then, of course, by patching and remediating misconfiguration is hardening the systems. I remind this, the time to remediate is extremely important. It's a race. Let's just think about it. The first one who gets there makes it, wins it. So the shortest possible the time to remediate, that's what the goal is for the defenders. Of course, there's a notion of prioritization. Not everything can be done at the same time. So but we need to make sure that this time to remediate is the shortest possible. And then last but not least, if despite all the effort, some breaches or compromise or intrusions happen, then you have, as we mentioned, it's almost from a process actually, and the endpoint detection and response, but also the extended detection and response. Really, to we mentioned the EPP, but EDRs with anti-malware embedded into it, so you can clearly make sure that this is also part of the equation. So protection against anti-malware, collection of telemetry, and clear then analysis and correlation to produce actionable and prioritize insights to then activate the response. So all this, again, I'll conclude by saying this: the key message is really to continuously reduce the time to resolution, understanding the broader context of the IT hybrid environment. So it's absolutely essential that we get there first before the attackers. So we really make the IT hybrid environment more solid, more robust, and more secure. So we're coming to the end. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. I look forward to hear from you. Actually, if you have any comments or any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can see my email actually displayed on screen right now. And I would really like to wish you a great Cyber Night with Saudi Federation for Cybersecurity and Programming. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Giuseppe. That was a very enlightening session from you. We were very glad to have you. I really enjoyed it, especially the part where you said that they hacked an aquarium in Las Vegas. That was interesting.
They actually did it. It's like a John Byrne actually kind of action movie, but that really happened. Right? Amazing, but it did happen. So
amazing. Well, thank you, Giuseppe. Me and the audience and SAP CSP are very looking forward to seeing you very soon again.
Thank you again, Hamad, and thank you all for your attention and participation. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.